We are what we pretend to be, so we must be very careful about what we pretend to be. That's a quote from one of my favorite authors, Kurt Vonnegut, and it's one that stuck with me ever since I was a rabid reader of his, ever since I was in my teenage years. Anyway, good hello, you are tuned into Glofcast 10, and I know I said last podcast next week's pod subject would be very quote-unquote personal. Well, I changed my mind for a few reasons. It's been, the last few weeks have been pretty hectic. It's been a very busy last few weeks. I've been just doing a lot of traveling, and it's been like, when you're driving between where I am now and where I need to be, it's like 7 hours both ways. So 7 hours there, 7 hours back. And I really couldn't find a decent place to make this thing, but rest assured, I'm still very invested in it. I still have a few, trying to get more guests lined up for this. This week's topic was originally going to be about my relationship to Catholicism, which I still might do a future podcast on that. And then it was going to be a comedy podcast with my cousin and a friend of ours called Wookcast. But neither of those panned out. Now, it was actually a little bit frustrating. So I essentially just changed the topic to neuroplasticity, and specifically how it relates to the research of sexologist Ray Blanchard, a famous and very controversial psychological researcher known for the Blanchards' transsexualism typology. So one might be wondering, why am I even doing this podcast necessarily? So with regards to neuroplasticity, I think it's helpful for people to know that they're, I guess, more in charge of their destiny than they realize, but it's also a gradual process. And specifically about Blanchardianism, because in my opinion, the topic of gender, orientation, and sex has become a very, very hot topic in the previous decade, and it's a topic that has caused both a lot of confusion for a lot of people ever since it really came onto the scene the way that it has. At its most fundamental, I believe it's a topic deserving of nuance, and a lot more nuance than is often given credit by either the left or the right. So today I intend to explore it. I am not a scientist or a psychologist. I have my master's degree in accounting, so that's, for all intents and purposes, I am approaching this from a lay person's perspective, and I'm just trying to kind of get the best feel for it that I can and explain it the best way that I can. So with all of that said, what the hell is neuroplasticity? At its most fundamental, it's the human brain's capacity to rewire itself. Now, Kurt Vonnegut, he was not a neurologist, but the quote at the beginning demonstrates the neuroplasticity simply better than any other. Dr. Celeste Campbell refers to neuroplasticity as the physiological changes in the brain that happen as the result of our interactions with our environment. From the time the brain begins to develop in utero until the day we die, the connections among the cells in our brain organize in response to our changing needs. This dynamic process allows us to learn from and adapt to different experiences. So that's beautiful, but at the same time terrifying. So the way I understand it, the brain rewires itself as a reaction to external stimuli. So if you experience a traumatic or stressful event, the connections in your brain will be rewired. And these events can even kill neurons. On the plus side, there are ways for the brain to adapt, replenish, regrow, and even recreate new neurons. And this is a related process called neurogenesis, and it's literally a word that means brain creation or brain beginning. So note that with regards to neuroplasticity, there exist two types. Structural neuroplasticity, which revolves around the strength of neurons and synapses, and functional neuroplasticity, which refers to the development in the brain due to learning. One can literally rewire a brain with everyday activities. So naturally, everybody knows this, naturally neuroplasticity decreases with age. With children having kind of a more neuroplastic, or I guess you could almost call it a fluid brain than adults, but neuroplasticity as a concept is still present in the brain throughout one's life. And I'm assuming any listeners here are adults, so you're wondering kind of how to rewire your brain positively. The answers are pretty straightforward. So exercise regularly, get good sleep, eat well. Naturally, you kind of know all of that. Interestingly, intermittent fasting also has a positive effect on synapse and neuron development. So there's an additional incentive to do that. I've been struggling with that for the past few weeks. But I would also say read books, play chess, learn a new language, learn an instrument. Boom. There's all sorts of ways you can really do it. Start meditating, maybe. So you should get the drift of neuroplasticity by now, and how to, I guess, rewire your brain to be more efficient. The harder part with that is actually doing it. So if you want an actual in-depth look at a recent neuroplasticity in action, I recommend the recent Joe Rogan podcast with Nick Yarris, a man who's frankly lived kind of a hell of a life, to say the least. On that podcast, he mentions being locked up in prison for 22 years for a crime he did not commit. It was a murder of a girl he had never met, and he was on death row for a while, and I believe he spent a large portion, if not most or all of those years, in solitary confinement. He's also had several other bad instances happening to him, such as the death of his daughter, being raped by a man, and various financial troubles. He's a guy that's gone through hell and back. Some people are kind of saying he's exaggerating or embellishing part of the story, but given everything he's gone through, it wouldn't be amiss for him to seem a little bit off. So he's mentioned that neuroplasticity has been the reason he's been able to adapt as well as he has, and he mentions that kind of multiple times given his horrific circumstances. So the adage, we are what we pretend to be by Vonnegut, rings true, I guess, neurologically through neuroplasticity. So it provides, I guess, incentives to meditate, don't do drugs, exercise regularly, obviously. You didn't need neuroplasticity to kind of tell you all that. But what I'm going to examine today is who is Ray Blanchard, what is Blanchardianism, and how does that relate exactly to neuroplasticity? Now, before I get into Blanchard, keep in mind that many trans individuals or activists automatically associate the Blanchardian transsexual typography with transphobia. Now, that is not my intent here, so view this right now as a disclaimer. Trans individuals are human beings and as such deserve the respect and decency afforded to all human beings, including their proper pronoun usage. This examination is done in good faith and curiosity, and I do not condone transphobia, nor do I condone the suppression of free speech and ideas for the sake of the promotion of agendas. And with that said, let's begin. Ray Blanchard is a sexologist known for his research on paraphilias, and most famously, like I said previously, his transsexual typography, which is also referred to as Blanchardianism. But he's also done research on pedophilia, sexual orientation, autoerotic asphyxiation, and just autoerotic asphyxiation. I didn't say that properly. And just paraphilias in general. Now, his transsexual typography is his theory that essentially puts all transsexual individuals, primarily trans women, into two categories: the homosexual transsexual, HSTS, and the autogynephile, AGP for short. Blanchard's theory has been the subject of a lot of controversy, mainly because many view it as transphobic, believes it reduces the transsexual condition to simply a paraphilia, it excludes trans men, especially from its explanation, but some have also called the theory unfalsifiable. Many defendants of Blanchardianism will extend the theory to apply to trans men, replacing AGP with autoandrophiles, or AAP. So, with all of this controversy, what exactly does the theory say? Well, as previously stated, Blanchard divides all transsexuals into two main reasons that they may transition. So, lifelong irrepressible gender nonconformity, or autogynephilia/autoandrophilia. The former is known shorthand as the homosexual transsexuals, or HSTS for short, and the latter is the AGP/AAP for short. Well, for the sake of this podcast, and to be super inclusive, we will call it A*P. So, what are the characteristics of the HSTS typography? Now, generally, these folks are gender nonconforming from a very early age and exhibit attraction to the same sex early on as well. which the Reddit wiki on Blanchardianism describes as HSTS people exist on the same etiological spectrum as gay cisgender people. The theory views HSTS and cisgender homosexuals as very similar, with the only difference being one transitions and the other does not. With this said, one could view HSTS transitions as simply a means for higher social success. For more information on HSTS, you can read J. Michael Bailey's book, The Man Who Would Be Queen. Now, in my opinion, the HSTS category is closer to the position of, I guess you could say, the mainstream trans academy, since it emphasizes born this way-ism, I guess you could say, more than the A*P categorization would. So with that said, let's look at the A*P or the autogynephile, autoandrophile category. So AGP in short is a type of paraphilia that results from the attraction of quote-unquote being a woman. And AAP is similar, but with the attraction is to being a man. A common fetish for the A*P individuals is transvestic cross-dressing, a type of fetish attracted to, you guessed it, cross-dressing. AGP/AAP individuals they're typically older, past puberty, with some of them coming to terms with their fetish well into their 20s or 30s, sometimes maybe even older than that. Many A*P transsexuals will often relate their life story to being similar to an HSTS, since that's kind of like I said earlier, the dominant or mainstream view in the current trans academy, despite the life experiences of the HSTS differing largely from the A*P. Now, both categories can be led to conclude that both are a result of paraphilias, although in different ways. Keep in mind that there are cisgender counterparts to both of these categories. Now, the HSTS is obviously just a cisgender homosexual person, but the autogynephilic transsexual can simply be an autogynephilic cissexual or cisgender, or just somebody who kind of views it as more a paraphilia, but that's kind of the extent that they want to keep it. They don't really want to transition to anything beyond that. So both types also experience gender dysphoria, but in two different ways, although both ways are related to their paraphilias. Now, HSTS transition primarily because of a desire to have sex with their birth sex, whereas A*P individuals transition because of their desire to be the opposite sex. And as stated earlier, A*P individuals transition at a later age than HSTS and often repress more forcefully than HSTS, since an HSTS that does not want to transition would just be a cisgender homosexual. Some people have proposed a third typology, which you could view as transition due to a sort of trauma, but most trans individuals can fit neatly into one of the two categories. So with all this said, what is an explanation for these two typography categories? Why do they happen? So as previously stated, the HSTS often transition for the sake of quote-unquote increased social success that they would receive as a woman as opposed to being a man or being the sex that they were born as. Now with A*P, it's a little bit more complex, and due to what's known as an erotic target location error, or ETLE, a fancy acronym or fancy term which means attraction to something not found in one's current sexual partners. So in the case of the A*P, the target error for the A*P transsexuals would be the self, or not even transsexuals, just autogynephilic, autoandrophilic individuals who don't necessarily need to be transsexual. Their target error would be the self, and Rod Fleming describes it as attraction to a character inside yourself and not necessarily outside yourself. So the ETLE can also successfully describe heterosexual men attracted to transsexual women, or heterosexual women attracted to transsexual men. It's a quote-unquote target error, one that causes a miswiring in the brain, which is where this arousal stems from. So this should explain the theory pretty succinctly. Now, many of you may already be aware of this theory, and none of this really may be new information, since there are more all-encompassing explanations of Blanchard out there. But Blanchardianism differs from the mainstream view in that people transition in the mainstream view simply to reduce gender dysphoria. So that would be a type of distress, a person feels due to their assigned birth, sex, or gender. Now, this dysphoria is relieved simply by transitioning. Now, for certain individuals, transitioning is the best option to alleviate gender dysphoria. But with that said, it is not an end-all be-all, and the belief of transition, even if you feel just a slight amount of dysphoria, I think is a little bit misguided. And I think it lacks nuance, and I don't really believe it to be true, especially given that the fact that the number of trans regrets is increasing. So in 2004, one article in The Guardian suggested that up to 20% of individuals who transitioned face regret about their decision. And since the amount of individuals who transitioned has increased since then, I can imagine that the amount of transition regret has increased as well. Maybe not by percentage, but by amount. And even if the 20% figure was called into question or overstated, the fact that there exists individuals who have regretted this transitioning, it's a testament to the fact that transitioning may not necessarily be the panacea and all be all advertised by certain groups. So, with all of this said, how does this all relate to neuroplasticity? With regards to A star P and neuroplasticity, one must remember that we are who we pretend to be, and make the necessary decisions based off of that. Now, I'm kind of going to go into a little side note here regarding pornography usage, since I think it's kind of a force that's necessarily having a kind of a detrimental effect on a lot of individuals of really this generation. So excessive pornography usage is linked to neuroplasticity and can potentially lead into more and more dysphoria that can quite literally rewire the brain in different ways that are severely different from individuals who don't use pornography. Now, excessive pornography use can be linked to anxiety, brain fog, inability to perform sexually with a partner, but how does it relate to AGP or AAP? Now, naturally, it depends on the type of porn the viewer watches, because it's naive to think that pornography does not affect the porn user's psychology, neurology, and sexuality. Now, multiple studies done on pornography as it relates to the former, but less with regards to a gender. So if you're an A star P individual, transsexual or not, who detests it and wish for the feelings to subside, I personally recommend stopping using pornography. That is just kind of my take. I know there's, with all that said, there are many A star P whose feelings are independent of pornography usage, and actually they've claimed pornography usage is one way that they can kind of take a little bit of more control over their paraphilia. So one of them is the Twitter user Michael Beltis, who, although per his own admission has autogynephilia, has decided not to transition and remains a man. Now, in addition, a very recent and controversial study came out that examined the causes of rapid onset gender dysphoria with postpubescent young adults that have shown no signs of gender dysphoria in early childhood. And specifically, this study examined the relationship of ROGD, or rapid onset gender dysphoria, with, social media and internet use and the number of relationships with transsexuals these young adults had. So roughly 82 of these were assigned female at birth. For the methodology, parents of these kids took a 90-minute SurveyMonkey survey. The survey was placed on 3 websites where parents discussed the ROGD of their children. So the results of this survey showed that roughly 63% of the young adults in question had a mental illness prior to the ROGD, 37% had mostly transsexual friend groups, 50% were beginning to isolate themselves from their families after coming out, and roughly 20 to 25% began exhibiting distrust of non-transgender people and began distancing themselves from their transgender friends. The conclusions of the study were ultimately inconclusive, declaring more research is needed to better understand this phenomenon, although Littman, the head of the study, did conclude that ROGD is a separate phenomenon from prior HSTS-style dysphoria. Now, all of this said, the study has not been without its critics, one of which blamed Lisa Littman of essentially begging the question with it. It's like going to an alt-right website and asking, well, who's the greatest race? Like, it's begging the question, and it's like, it's not a it's not the best way to kind of go about it. It begs the question that the people coming to it already have these presuppositions which can't really be weeded out. So my personal take on it is I personally don't believe ROGD is necessarily accidental in most cases, and that a cause must have caused it in some way, shape, or form. But like I said, I'm not a psychologist or scientist, so take whatever I say with a grain of salt. There are a variety of other ways that relate to neuroplasticity and Blanchardianism, and that other lifestyle changes may be needed in order to make particular feelings subside. So that's kind of the end of it for now. For more information on Blanchardianism, I do recommend Rod Fleming's YouTube channel. He gives quite a bit, a little more detailed expose on it. For somebody who opposes it, Contrapoints does a pretty good expose on autogynephilia. Also, I'd recommend the work of Dr. James Cantor, the work of Dr. Oren Amitay, the books The Man Who Would Be Queen by J. Michael Bailey, Men Trapped in Men's Bodies by Anne Lawrence, and of course the original article by Ray Blanchard called The Concept of Autogynephilia and the Typology of Male Gender Dysphoria, and that's found in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, and the original article is from 1989. So in closing, this is a very, very deep topic, and people much smarter than me have already done a large degree of research on it. So I hope that this was a good introduction and offered a few good insights. I've listed my sources in the deep topic, and people much smarter than me have already done a large degree of research on it. So I hope that this was a good introduction and offered a few good insights. I've listed my sources in the description if you wanted to check those out. Anyway, thank you for tuning into Glofcast 10, and I hope to see you all next week. Take care.